I work at Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research in Potsdam in Germany. I'm a postdoc actually in a other project. It's called RECLIM. It's on regional climate changes. It's a quite big project with a lot of centers in Germany contributing. So it's a quite diverse community in terms of research interests and also in terms of fields. And my main research interests are really land, surface, and atmosphere interactions. So what are the feedbacks between the land and the atmosphere? So if you change vegetation, what does it do to circulation? And then how do those circulation changes, for example, feed back to the changes in the land that you see? And that's both for vegetation and also for soil processes, especially in the Arctic for permafrost processes. Like every model that you build of whatever kind of thing you want to look at, a climate model is a simplification of reality, of the processes that we understand, and a lot of guessing about processes we don't understand. And from all of this, we try to make a picture of reality that we can understand to some extent. And it's like a sandbox, so we can play with it. That means that if we have an idea about a specific process and are interested in it, we can actually change it in the model and see what happens. And I mean, to get an idea if what you do has any meaning, one of the first steps you usually do is you take your model and run it for something where you have an idea what the output should look like. So in our case, usually you run for the past, like for the satellite observation period, and then you compare your model output with measurements, and then you get an idea of how good or bad your model is doing. Yeah, but it's, I mean, you have to always keep in mind that it's just your picture of reality. It's not reality, right? It's just, you can't do anything you don't put in there. So if you don't know about something that's actually going on, it's not in there. Yeah.
Right. You have in the first paragraph there is the term quantitative biogeoengineering.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So one of the base ideas behind this proposal that Bruce has been like working on for ages is to interpret herding, reindeer herding, as a big biogeoengineering experiment that's been going on for a long time, because people have herded reindeer in specific ways for a long time. And so the idea is that, okay, maybe take a step back. I'll tell you a story. There is a global land surface model that models vegetation and fire and soil and stuff like that for the whole globe. And it has to simplify, of course. It can't like model every individual tree or something. So there are specific, they're called plant functional types. So there are like classes for the plants, you put them in, and then they behave differently, and they spread throughout the world. And like, if you set a model like this up in, like, say, the year 0 and run it, and then you hope to come up with a vegetation distribution after 2,000 years that at least roughly looks like what is in the world today, then you have to account for humans in the system. So we cut trees, we build crops, we make rice fields, stuff like that. But another thing that you have to do, if you don't want the whole North American continent to be covered by woods, you have to introduce big grazers. Otherwise, there is no prairie. It just doesn't exist. And the same goes for northern Russia. If there are no big grazers, there is no tundra. It's basically steppe landscapes, they don't exist. Because if there is no buffalo eating the saplings of the trees,
Mm.
They will eventually spread if you give them enough time. So so basically there are natural, and that's like basically the thing that Bruce says is a biogeoengineering thing, right? Because if you keep reindeer, they have a similar impact on your environment, like the buffaloes had in the past on the North American continent, for example, or the caribou have, like, for example, in Canada. If you take the caribou out of Canada, then you will have a lot more forests than you have today.
Mm.
So and then reindeer are, so one of the things they do is eat saplings. Another thing they do is they don't like any trees. They are specific eaters.
Mm.
So they will actually push some species to become trees, and others will just not be there because they are eaten.
Right.
So, and then depending on how you keep them, if you let them go freely and just follow, or if you have specific areas where you keep them and move this, those impacts will be differently spread, right? And another thing that they do is they disturb snow cover in winter by trying to find food, which alters snow albedo, which alters radiation, which alters a lot of things. So, and then they compact the ground that they walk on, which actually protects permafrost in the ground. So if you have forests with reindeer in them, the permafrost is likely to be more stable than if you have forests without reindeer in them. So all of those impacts that big grazers have on the land surface can be interpreted as some kind of biogeoengineering that you're putting in a more or less natural way. And if you change the way that you herd, you might change, or you change the impact your animals have on the environment, and that might cause a lot of a long chain of other changes. This is a way of, if you run a global climate model for a projection of the future. So you have those economic pathways that the IPCC comes up with, depending on how humanity will act in the future economically. So will there be more focus on local economics, or will there still be global trade? Will we go away from burning so much coal to more renewable energy, stuff like that? Okay, so you come up with basically those economic scenarios, come up with greenhouse gas emissions. So how much CO2 is emitted and where? And that's basically the input for a global climate model. It's called a forcing. So, I mean, how much CO2 you have in the atmosphere will have an impact on what your climate looks like. And then this kind of forcing goes into a global climate model, and then you run it for, let's say, the next 300 years. So a common period is to run from 2000 to 2300. You run a historical period, usually that's something like 1950 to 2000, to see how good the model performs. Mm. And then you run this, what is called a projection or a scenario, because you put in the greenhouse gas emission is a scenario in this kind of terms. And then you see how the world changes in this specific model, of course, under this specific emission scenario. But global climate models still are pretty coarse in their resolution. So if you want to look at biodiversity changes, so if you want to have the impact of reindeer grazing in Finland, if Finland is like 6 grid cells, then you can't do much with it. So what you do is called, or one of the things you can do, and what we are going to do, is called dynamical downscaling. So you take the output, like the results from the global model, and use them to force another model that is then not global, but confined to the region of your interest, and can be run in much higher resolutions. So we're going to go at least for 25 kilometers, but I don't think that's where it's going to end, because for looking at really the specific impacts on surface that we want to look at, we will go down to probably, for the land, at least a 5 kilometer atmosphere. We will have to see.
I see. So, but how does it work then that if, I assume the inputs to the model are the same, but you're going at a higher resolution. Is that correct?
Now the input is not the same. So basically, if you have a global Earth system model, then the only forcing that really goes in there is like the solar constant. So what's the solar cycle doing? So what's your energy forcing at the top of the atmosphere, and the greenhouse gases. And then some people put some random, for example, volcanic eruptions in there. But yeah, not everyone does it, but it's one other like natural forcing that you might have is like, I don't know, every 20 years or so, you have a major volcanic eruption that actually puts sulfur in the top of the atmosphere, and then something happens.
Yeah.
That's like the only external forcing a global Earth system model would need. But for a regional model, you need to force with the climate that was produced by the global model. So you would force with temperature, with wind, with humidity, and at the borders of the area that you're interested in. But inside the domain, what you do with this is like the large scale processes are given by the global forcing, but all the small scale processes that the model can look at better because it runs at a higher resolution are kind of free. So you keep like the general direction that the climate moves through the data that is given by the global model, but you kind of refine that with a higher resolution regional model. That's what's called dynamical downscaling, because you have a dynamical other model that downscales the global model. Snow is one of the bad things in global models. The other really bad thing is clouds. So things that we do not represent well in our global models because either we don't know enough about the processes, like with clouds, or because the processes are so small scale, like with snow, that it is even in like a 1 kilometer grid cell, your representation of snow will not be close to reality. Because snow is like, if you walk through a forest, for example, you will see that where it's clear, the snow is low, and where it's not clear, the snow might be high. And then around all the trees, you might have those holes like around the trunk of the tree, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you put sunlight on top of this, then this difference in the snowpack will affect radiation, and it will affect the ground below the snow, because snow is an isolator. So it isolates the ground from the atmosphere that can warm or cool. That depends on where you are in the season, and it also depends on what the soil is looking below the snow. And then actually, for example, if there is like high grasses in the snowpack, then it will be different than if the snowpack is undisturbed. So snow is really
complex,
difficult, and very complex, and very, very small scale. So it's very hard to have good representation of snow in coarse scale models. And this ESM SnowMap is so it's a model into comparison project where different Earth system models compare their snow schemes and the impact that their snow schemes have on their model results. Yeah, we call it upscaling. So I mean, you have all this. You might even have a lot of small scale information, because you, for example, you might have a good idea of the vegetation in a grid cell. You might also have a good idea of what the digital elevation model looks like. So you actually have an idea where snow might be high, or where it has a chance to be compacted, or you might have like areas where the snow is blown to. There is maybe a ridge, and along that ridge, you collect all this wind-blown snow, and then you have like a huge snow height that, for example, in spring takes ages to melt. While everywhere around the ground is already snow-free, you still have those patches of snow where there was wind-blown snow or things like that. And Yeah, it's people try to come up with what we call a parametrization. So something where you kind of upscale those effects depending on the digital elevation model, depending on the vegetation that you have, depending on the soil type. So you can kind of find generalizations that you can put into coarser scale models. So you actually don't model the small scale process, but you have an idea of what the result of the small scale process is in the scale that the model looks at. But that's really complicated. Yeah, and I mean, looking at this in global Earth system models, looking at the snow schemes and seeing how they differ and what the impact is, gives you an idea what uncertainties are introduced into those models by the differences in the snow scheme. I find it really interesting and difficult. So it's like, first thing is language. So actually talk to people in a way that they understand what you're talking about without boring them to death. And also like, it's also the other way around. So actually what I mean, they are experts in their field, right? So, and their field has a specific language as well that I might not be able to grasp, where I just, yeah, don't get things they're saying because I'm missing some basic concepts that are totally obvious to them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it works if everyone is, in my experience, it works if everyone is really interested in this. So if no one was like made to sit there and do this, but if everyone is really interested, then it's kind of cool. The most challenging thing, I think, is going to be to take what the anthropologists and the people who really interact with the communities come up with. So they come up with maybe plans or ideas of how to, let's say very specifically, how to change or how to adjust their way of herding, of living with their animals. And then what we need to do is we need to do a translation of this into physical changes of parameters that we can put into our models, and then actually see what happens if we do that. And then we can look at the impact this has on a number of things. Like one thing obviously is like, how does it impact cryosphere? Then how does that feed back to the atmosphere, for example? Does it change more than just the local area climate? Does it have an impact on, for example, on circumpolar circulation or stuff like this? And then actually come back and take our results and back translate them into something that people can go back to the communities and tell them, look, if you do it like this, the impact might be like this. And that's why maybe that's not a good idea, and try to come up with something different. So there are, as far as I see, there are 5 groups who will do active modeling, and then we have like a number of people. Oh, 6. There's a 6th group who came in right at the end. And then there are a number of people from the other work packages who are also in there to kind of help and advise in the development of the scenarios that we're going to use. Right. And like a lot of people in our work package are actually also with at least some person months in the other work packages to like facilitate communication between the work packages, because that's really something that this whole kind of proposal relies on, good communication between all people. But it kind of illustrates that really the work of the other work packages really feeds into this climate modeling, and then what we produce kind of goes back to them and to their work and to their communication with the communities also.